shimmered under the glow of golden streetlights, a deceptive beauty that masked the chaos within Karen Adams' heart. She sat at the dimly lit corner of the upscale bar, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the rim of her glass, the ice clinking softly against the amber liquid. Tonight, she wasn't the responsible woman who always had her life together. She was just a broken heart nursing its wounds. Her longtime boyfriend had betrayed her, shattering the illusion of love she had desperately held on to. As she stared into her drink, she wondered if love was even real or if it was just a cruel joke played by fate. That was when she saw him, a man with an air of quiet dominance, sitting across the bar, watching her with an unreadable gaze. He was tall, striking, and radiated an effortless authority. His dark eyes held a flicker of something she couldn't quite place, curiosity, perhaps even longing. Their eyes locked, and for a moment the world around them blurred into irrelevance. It wasn't about attraction, it was about escape. Howard Lewis had no intention of being at this bar tonight, yet here he was, drawn to a woman who looked like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. He recognized that pain, it mirrored his own. He was a man burdened by responsibilities, suffocated by expectations, haunted by losses he never spoke about. He had learned long ago that emotions were dangerous and attachments only led to heartbreak. But tonight, in the dim glow of the bar, with a woman who looked equally lost, he wanted to forget. He walked toward her, his movements confident yet unhurried, and when he finally spoke, his voice was smooth, deliberate. "You look like you could use a distraction," he murmured, his gaze never leaving hers. Karen hesitated, her pulse quickening, but then she nodded. Just this once, she would let herself go. Just this once, she would surrender to the unknown. And so they left the bar together, two strangers bound by nothing but pain, stepping into the night with no names, no promises, and no expectations, just a fleeting moment of solace. The morning light crept into the small bedroom, painting golden streaks across the white sheets. Karen stirred awake, her body wrapped in warmth that wasn't her own. A momentary confusion settled in as she blinked against the morning haze, the scent of cologne and something distinctly masculine lingering on her skin. Then it hit her, the night before, the whispered words, the tangled sheets, the fleeting comfort of a stranger's arms. Her breath caught as she turned to find the space beside her empty. No note, no lingering presence, just an imprint on the pillow and the distant hum of the city outside. Just like that, he was gone. A hollow ache spread through her chest, but she forced herself up, reminding herself that this was exactly what she had wanted. No strings, no attachments, just a night to forget. Yet as she gathered her clothes, a strange emptiness settled deep within her, an unshakable feeling that she had lost something she never even had the chance to know. Weeks passed, and Karen's life returned to routine except for one glaring change. She was late. Dread pooled in her stomach as she stood in front of the bathroom mirror, pregnancy test in hand. The little stick in her grasp might as well have been a ticking time bomb. Her pulse pounded as the second pink line boldly appeared, sealing her fate. "No," she whispered, shaking her head as if denial could erase the reality before her. This wasn't part of the plan. She was barely holding her life together, still reeling from heartbreak, still trying to piece herself back into someone whole. How could she bring a child into this world? How could she raise a baby alone? She gripped the edge of the sink, tears burning her eyes as the weight of her decision settled. There was no father to tell, no number to call, just her and the life growing inside her. And in that moment, she made the choice. She would keep the baby. No matter how hard it got, no matter what she had to sacrifice, she would love this child with everything she had. Howard sat in his high-rise office, staring out over the city that had made him a king, yet it all felt like a prison of his own design. His assistant droned on about upcoming meetings and financial reports, but his mind was trapped in the past, a night 5 years ago that refused to fade. He should have let it go. He had convinced himself that it meant nothing, that it had been just another fleeting moment, yet something about her haunted him. The way she had looked at him, the silent understanding in her eyes, the way she had held him as if she too were drowning. He had tried to find her afterward, a foolish attempt driven by something he couldn't quite name. But she had vanished like a ghost, leaving nothing behind. Even now, after all the success, all the power, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had left something unfinished. A knock at his door pulled him back to the present, and his assistant peeked in hesitantly. "Mr. Lewis, the board meeting is about to begin." He nodded curtly, pushing himself up from his chair, but as he walked toward the conference room, a quiet, unspoken thought gripped him. What if he had found her? What if he had been meant to? What if that night hadn't been just an escape, but something more? He would never know. His life had moved forward, and so had hers, wherever she was. He had no choice but to let the past rest where it belonged, buried beneath the weight of time and responsibilities. Or so he thought, because fate was not done with him yet. Karen pulled her coat tighter around herself as she entered the gleaming lobby of Lewis Enterprises, the very name making her stomach tighten with nerves. It had taken months of job applications, countless interviews, and sheer determination to land this opportunity, and she couldn't afford to mess it up. Her son, Aaron, was counting on her. She adjusted her blouse, inhaling deeply as she approached the front desk. "Karen Adams. I'm here for my first day in the finance department." The receptionist gave a polite nod and gestured toward the elevators. This was her fresh start. She had promised herself that she wouldn't let anything, or anyone, distract her from securing a better future for her son. Yet, as she stepped into the elevator, a strange unease coiled in her chest, as if something, or someone, was waiting for her just beyond those doors. Howard leaned over his desk, skimming through reports when the knock came. "Come in," he said absently, not bothering to look up. The shuffle of papers, the scent of faint perfume, it wasn't until her voice echoed through the space that his entire world tilted. "Good morning, sir. I'm Karen Adams. I'll be working under the finance division as of today." His pen slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the desk. His head snapped up, and for the first time in years, he felt shock steal his breath. The woman standing before him was the ghost of his past, the one who got away, the one he never stopped thinking about. And yet, she looked at him with blank professionalism, completely unaware that he was the man she had spent that unforgettable night with 5 years ago, the man who might have unknowingly left something more behind than just memories. Karen kept her posture straight, her hands clasped professionally in front of her, willing herself to ignore the strange tension in the air. Howard's eyes were locked on her, his expression unreadable. But there was something behind those dark irises, an emotion she couldn't quite place. The moment felt off, as if there was something unspoken lingering between them. But she dismissed it. She had met plenty of intimidating CEOs before, and they all carried the same commanding presence. That's all it was. "Welcome to Lewis Enterprises, Miss Adams," Howard finally said, his voice composed, but a flicker of hesitation in his tone. "I hope you'll find your time here productive." Karen nodded, relieved that the initial meeting was brief. "I'm grateful for the opportunity, Mr. Lewis." She turned, ready to leave his office, but just before she reached the door, she felt his gaze still on her. It was unnerving, but she refused to let it shake her. She had worked too hard to be here. Nothing, not even an inexplicable sense of déjà vu, would ruin that. Howard sat frozen long after the door closed behind her, his fingers unconsciously tightening around the armrests of his chair. It couldn't be. Could it? She looked exactly the same, yet there was no sign of recognition in her eyes. Had he imagined it? Was it just his mind playing tricks on him? His thoughts swirled in chaos, piecing together fragments of a night that had haunted him for 5 years. The tilt of her chin, the cadence of her voice, even the way she had stood with quiet confidence. It was all so familiar. But if she was the woman from that night, why did she not seem to remember him? And why did this unsettled feeling gnaw at him so deeply? Pushing back from his desk, Howard took a deep breath. There was only one way to know for sure. He needed to watch her. If she truly was the woman from his past, the truth would reveal itself in time. Days passed, and Howard found himself watching Karen far more closely than he should have. Every interaction, every small detail, every movement, he analyzed it all. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was thinking, the quiet, determined way she worked, completely unaware of the growing scrutiny she was under. There was something there. He could feel it, but he needed proof. It wasn't until a business trip, an overnight conference where the team had been required to attend, that everything changed. As Karen adjusted her blazer while preparing for a presentation, her blouse slipped slightly, revealing a small birthmark on her shoulder. Howard's entire body tensed as recognition slammed into him like a freight train. It was her, the very woman he had spent years searching for, the woman he had assumed was lost to him forever. His breath caught in his throat, his mind reeling as he tried to process what this meant. How had she ended up here, working for him of all people? Fate had brought her back, but why? He needed answers. He needed to know why she had disappeared, why she had never looked for him. But as his eyes flickered to her face, he realized something even more unsettling. She still didn't recognize him. Had she forgotten that night? Or was she hiding something? A strange sense of unease settled over him, mixed with something deeper, something almost primal. What if that night had meant more than he had ever imagined? What if there were secrets Karen was keeping? He had to find out, and he wouldn't stop until he did. Howard's mind refused to rest after seeing the birthmark. There was no doubt now Karen was the woman from that night. But something wasn't adding up. If she truly didn't remember him, then why? And if she did, why was she pretending not to? He watched her from across the office, his fingers drumming against his desk as he considered his next move. Was it possible she was hiding something? He had built an empire on instincts, on knowing when people were lying to him. And right now, Karen was hiding something. He just didn't know what. His curiosity turned into a quiet obsession, his need for answers growing stronger by the day. But it wasn't just about that night anymore. There was something about her, something that made him want to know everything. Karen, meanwhile, was unaware of Howard's growing turmoil. She had fallen into her work with ease, balancing spreadsheets and presentations, determined to prove herself. But something felt off. Howard watched her too closely. His presence in meetings was intense, his gaze lingering on her far longer than necessary. She had worked for demanding bosses before, but this was different. It wasn't scrutiny. It was something else, something that made her skin tingle with unease. One evening, as she gathered her things to leave, she found Howard standing by the window, his expression unreadable. "Ms. Adams," he called before she could step out. "Have we met before?" The question sent a jolt through her chest, but she forced a polite smile. "I don't believe so, sir." His dark eyes bore into hers, searching, analyzing. Karen had no idea that in that moment she had just ignited a firestorm she wouldn't be able to escape. Howard didn't sleep that night. The resemblance was there, too obvious to ignore. Karen's mannerisms, her voice, even the way she carried herself, it was all the same. But what troubled him most was Aaron. That little boy's face had flashed in his mind ever since he had first seen the photo on Karen's desk. There was something hauntingly familiar about him. His sharp features, the same dark eyes, the way his brow furrowed in deep concentration. Howard had brushed it off at first, but now he couldn't. Something inside him whispered that he needed to look deeper. With a sense of urgency, Howard did what he had never considered before. He ordered an investigation into Karen's past. Karen had no idea that Howard was digging into her life. She spent her evenings at home, unwinding after long days, oblivious to the storm brewing around her. Aaron sat at the kitchen table, drawing a picture of his family, him and his mother. Karen smiled, her heart aching at the empty space beside them. He had started asking about his father more often, his innocent questions leaving her grasping for words. "Was he nice, Mommy?" Aaron asked one night, his small fingers coloring in the background of his drawing. Karen hesitated, swallowing the lump in her throat. I don't know, sweetheart," she admitted softly, brushing a hand through his curls, because the truth was, she didn't know anything about him. She had spent years convincing herself that it didn't matter, that she had made the right choice by never looking back. But fate had other plans, because in that very moment, Howard was discovering the truth, and nothing would ever be the same again. Howard stood outside Karen's office, his pulse hammering against his ribs, the weight of 5 years of unanswered questions crushing him. The results had confirmed what he already knew in his gut. Aaron was his son. The moment the private investigator handed him the document, Everything inside him shifted. 5 years. 5 years of not knowing, of searching for a ghost while she had carried the truth in silence. His grip on the file in his hand tightened as he finally stepped inside, shutting the door behind him with a quiet, deliberate click. Karen looked up from her desk, her face shifting from mild curiosity to something unreadable when she saw the storm brewing in his eyes. "Mr. Lewis?" she asked, her tone controlled, but he wasn't fooled. There was something guarded beneath it. He walked toward her slowly, placing the manila folder onto the desk between them. "Open it," he ordered, his voice dangerously low. Karen hesitated, but something in his demeanor made her fingers tremble as she reached for the folder. The second she saw the contents, her stomach twisted violently. DNA test results. The numbers were indisputable. She barely registered the sound of her own breath hitching before she snapped the folder shut, her eyes darting back to his. The accusation in his gaze was suffocating. "You had no right," she bit out, pushing the file away as if it burned her. Howard leaned in, his hands pressed firmly against the desk, trapping her in place. "No right?" he echoed, his voice sharp with barely contained anger. "You kept my son from me for 5 years, Karen. 5 years." She tried to swallow the lump in her throat, but his words sliced into her like a blade. "I didn't know how to find you," she whispered, but he shook his head. "No," he said coldly, "you didn't try." The air between them grew thick with tension, the past colliding violently with the present. Karen clenched her fists, her chest tightening as old wounds reopened. "What was I supposed to do?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "Walk into a corporate office and announce that I was pregnant with some stranger's child?" She shook her head, pain flashing in her eyes. "I had nothing to go on, Howard. No name, no number. And by the time I accepted what had happened, it was too late." Her words were laced with frustration, but Howard wasn't willing to let it slide. "Too late for what, Karen?" he shot back, his voice rising. "Too late to let me know I had a son? Too late to give me the chance to be his father?" He ran a hand through his hair, his breathing ragged. "You made that decision for me." Karen's throat tightened. "I did what I had to do to survive." She forced herself to meet his gaze, refusing to crumble beneath his anger. "Aaron is my entire world. I raised him alone, Howard. I gave up everything to give him a life. Don't stand there and act like I robbed you of something when you never even looked for me." Howard's expression flickered with something unreadable, but then his jaw hardened. "And now what, Karen?" he asked, his voice low but no less intense. "Now that I know the truth, do you expect me to walk away?" He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "No, that's not happening." He straightened, his presence towering over her. "Aaron is my son, and I will be in his life whether you like it or not." Karen's stomach clenched, her pulse unsteady. She had fought so hard to protect her son, but now everything was unraveling. Karen barely made it home before the weight of the confrontation crashed down on her. She paced the small living room, her hands clenched into tight fists as Aaron played quietly in the corner, unaware that his entire world had just changed. She had always feared this moment, the day she would no longer be able to protect him from the truth. She had convinced herself that keeping Howard in the dark was the right decision, that Aaron didn't need a father who had disappeared without a trace. But now, Howard wasn't just a memory from her past. He was standing in her present, demanding a role in Aaron's life. The thought made her stomach churn. Could she really trust him? Could she risk opening a door that might lead to more heartbreak? The knock at her front door made her stiffen. She already knew who it was. Taking a deep breath, she turned the handle, and there he stood, Howard, looking as determined as ever. "I'm not here to fight," he said, stepping inside before she could refuse him. His gaze softened for the first time that day as it flickered to the small child playing on the floor. His son. Karen's breath caught as she watched the way Howard's entire demeanor changed. He looked different, less guarded, more vulnerable. Aaron, sensing a new presence, looked up at Howard with wide, curious eyes. "Who are you?" the little boy asked, his voice innocent. Howard swallowed hard, emotion thickening his throat as he crouched down, really looking at his son for the first time. I'm I'm a friend of your mom's," he managed, his voice strained. Karen watched, torn between fear and something she refused to name. Howard glanced at her, his expression unreadable. I want to do this the right way, Karen, he murmured. But make no mistake, I will be in his life, with or without your permission. Karen sat stiffly across from Howard at the dimly lit cafe, her fingers curled tightly around her cup as steam curled into the air between them. This wasn't how she imagined her life going. She had spent years building a world where she and Aaron were safe, where she had control over their lives, where she never had to answer to a man who had once been nothing more than a fleeting memory. But now, the very foundation of that world was shaking beneath her feet, and the man responsible for it sat before her with an expression that was both firm and unreadable. Let's be civil about this, Howard said, his voice calm but laced with quiet authority. I don't want to drag Aaron through a custody battle. I don't want to make this ugly, but I won't be sidelined in my son's life. Karen swallowed hard, her throat dry. And what does that mean exactly? She asked, forcing herself to meet his gaze. You expect to just walk in and play father overnight? Do you have any idea what that could do to him? Howard exhaled slowly, setting his coffee cup down with deliberate care. I'm not here to disrupt his life, Karen. I'm here to be part of it. And whether you like it or not, Aaron has a right to know me. His voice softened, but the intensity in his eyes remained. I don't expect this to be easy. I don't expect you to trust me right away, but I'm asking you to meet me halfway. Karen let out a quiet, humorless laugh, shaking her head. Halfway? She repeated, the word tasting bitter on her tongue. You don't get to ask for halfway when you weren't there for the first 5 years. Howard's jaw tightened, but he didn't lash out. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice steady. I didn't know, Karen, but now that I do, I'm not walking away. There was something unshakable in his tone, something that made Karen's stomach tighten with dread. Because no matter how much she wanted to fight him, she knew Howard Lewis wasn't going anywhere. Howard stood outside Karen's apartment door, his heart pounding harder than it had in years. He had stood before boardrooms of ruthless investors, negotiated billion-dollar deals, made decisions that shifted the entire industry, but nothing had ever felt this terrifying, because on the other side of this door was his son, a little boy who didn't know him, a little boy who had lived 5 years of life without him. His palms felt clammy as he forced himself to knock. When the door opened, Karen was there, her expression wary but resigned. You're sure about this? She asked softly, and for the first time since they had started this war of emotions, she looked uncertain. Howard swallowed and nodded. Yes, he said firmly, though inside, his stomach twisted with nerves. Karen stepped aside, letting him in, and the moment he walked into the small but cozy living room, his breath caught in his throat. Aaron sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by colorful building blocks, humming softly to himself as he stacked them into a careful tower. Howard could see himself in the child's concentrated expression, in the way his brow furrowed in determination. He had seen photos, but seeing Aaron in person was different. The boy was real. His son was real. He wanted to move, to speak, but his throat was tight. Before he could find his voice, Aaron looked up, his dark brown eyes blinking in curiosity. Who's that? The little boy asked, tilting his head toward his mother. Karen exhaled slowly, kneeling beside him. Aaron, this is Mr. Howard, she said gently. He's an old friend. The words were cautious, carefully chosen. Aaron studied Howard with the same quiet intensity Howard had spent years perfecting. Then, in the simplest, most unexpected way, the boy smiled. Do you want to help me build my tower? Howard's breath shuddered out of him. It was just a small moment, but it felt like everything. Karen stood in the kitchen, her arms folded as she listened to the distant sound of Aaron's giggles filtering in from the living room. She had expected awkwardness, tension, maybe even a refusal from Aaron to interact with Howard. But instead, her son had accepted him with the same open heart he accepted everything in life. It was both beautiful and terrifying, because if Aaron let Howard in too easily, it meant she might not be able to shut him out. And that scared her more than she cared to admit. Lucy's voice echoed in her mind from their conversation earlier that day. You can't fight fate, Karen. You can't fight what's meant to be. But Karen had spent years fighting, building walls, protecting herself and her son from heartbreak. Was she really ready to let those walls crumble now? The sound of footsteps behind her made her stiffen, and when she turned, Howard was there, his expression unreadable. "He's incredible," he said softly, his voice filled with something raw. "You did an amazing job with him." Karen's throat tightened at the unexpected compliment. She should have deflected, should have reminded him that she had done it alone. But instead, she looked away, gripping the edge of the counter. "He's my entire world," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Howard exhaled sharply, stepping closer, his presence warm and unnervingly steady. "I don't want to take that from you, Karen," he said, his tone softer now. "I just want to be part of it." The vulnerability in his voice was almost unbearable, because for the first time she saw it, the regret, the guilt, the longing. The man who had walked into her life 5 years ago as a stranger was standing before her now, offering something she never expected, an apology. But apologies didn't erase the past. They didn't undo the years of solitude, the nights she had spent awake with a crying baby, the sacrifices she had made. "I don't know if I can trust you," she finally admitted, her voice thick with unspoken emotions. Howard didn't flinch. He simply nodded. "Then let me prove that you can." Howard found himself spending more time with Aaron than he ever imagined possible. What started as brief, supervised meetings had slowly evolved into something deeper, something more significant. It wasn't just about getting to know his son. It was about becoming someone Aaron could depend on. He found himself fascinated by the small details, the way Aaron's face lit up when he talked about dinosaurs, the way he scrunched his nose when he concentrated, the way his little hands fit into Howard's so easily. But despite their growing bond, there was still an unspoken barrier between him and Karen. She watched their interactions carefully, guarded, unwilling to fully trust his presence. Howard understood. Trust wasn't given freely, it was earned, and he was willing to do the work. One evening, as Aaron excitedly showed him his latest drawing, Howard caught Karen leaning against the kitchen doorway, arms crossed. "You're good with him," she admitted reluctantly. "I wasn't sure how this would go, but you're trying." The words, though simple, felt like the first crack in the wall she had built between them. Howard set Aaron's drawing down carefully before turning to face her. "I don't just want to try, Karen. I want to be here, permanently." His voice was firm, but there was something vulnerable in the way he said it, as if he knew she was waiting for him to give up and walk away. Karen let out a slow breath, stepping further into the room, but the hesitation in her gaze remained. "Aaron loves easily," she murmured, "but he also gets hurt easily." Her words carried more weight than she likely intended, and Howard didn't miss the unspoken message buried beneath them. She wasn't just talking about Aaron, she was talking about herself too. Howard met her gaze, his expression unwavering. "I have no intention of hurting him, or you." Karen let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Intentions mean nothing if they aren't followed through, Howard." She turned away, her shoulders tense. "Prove it." Karen hadn't expected to say yes, yet somehow she found herself standing in front of Howard's penthouse door, her hand poised to knock. What had started as an attempt to co-parent had slowly become something neither of them could define. The boundaries between them were blurring, and that terrified her. But what terrified her more was the realization that Aaron was growing more attached to Howard with each passing day. And if she was being honest with herself, so was she. When the door swung open, Howard stood before her, dressed in a crisp white shirt, his sleeves rolled up just enough to reveal the strong forearms that made something stir in her stomach. She hated how familiar he was starting to feel. "You made it," he said, a small smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "I was beginning to think you'd change your mind." Karen huffed, stepping inside before she lost the nerve. "I still might," she shot back, but even as she said it, she knew she wouldn't. Dinner was surprisingly normal. Howard had prepared everything himself, a detail that surprised her. She had half expected catered food, a display of wealth and convenience, but instead she was met with the scent of home-cooked pasta and garlic bread, something so unexpectedly domestic that it threw her off balance. Aaron sat between them, happily stuffing his face, oblivious to the undercurrents between his parents. Every now and then, Howard's hand would brush against hers as they reached for the same dish, sending an electric charge through her skin. She told herself it was nothing, that it meant nothing. But when their eyes met across the table, something heavy settled between them. After Aaron had fallen asleep on the couch, Howard walked Karen to the door, his hand brushing against her lower back. "Stay for a little while," he murmured, and for a moment, just a fleeting, reckless moment, she wanted to. But she shook her head, forcing herself to step back. "Good night, Howard." And then she left, leaving him standing in the doorway, watching her go. Dorothy Lewis had always prided herself on being a woman who saw the world for what it truly was. And what she saw now was a problem that needed to be handled before it spiraled out of control. Karen Adams, a woman from nowhere, suddenly entangled in Howard's life, threatening the future Dorothy had carefully constructed for her stepson. She wouldn't allow it. Howard was a Lewis, and with that name came power, responsibility, and legacy. He was meant to marry well, to align himself with someone of status, not a single mother with a child he had only just discovered. And you're going to lose. Karen's heart pounded, but she refused to look away. She had faced worse than this. She wouldn't back down now. Karen sat across from Dorothy in the sleek, high-end cafe, her grip tightening around her coffee cup as the older woman's words sank like stones in her chest. "I know your type, Miss Adams," Dorothy said, her voice smooth yet sharp, like a finely honed blade. "You see a wealthy man, a powerful one, and you think having his child entitles you to something. But let me be clear, you are nothing more than a distraction. Howard has responsibilities, a future that doesn't include a woman like you." Karen forced herself to remain composed, though anger burned beneath her skin. She had been expecting this confrontation. But hearing the venom in Dorothy's tone made it clear the woman would stop at nothing to push her away. "I'm not after Howard's money," Karen said, keeping her voice measured. "I never was. I didn't even know who he was when I had Aaron." Dorothy chuckled, the sound devoid of humor. "Perhaps. But that doesn't change the fact that you are a problem that needs to be dealt with." She leaned in, her gaze cold and calculating. "Walk away now, and I'll make sure you're compensated handsomely. Refuse, and I promise you, you'll regret it." Karen's heart pounded, but she refused to let her fear show. "I don't need your money, and I don't need your threats," she said, standing abruptly. "Aaron deserves to know his father, and Howard deserves the chance to be in his son's life. Whatever issues you have with that are yours alone." Dorothy's expression darkened, but she remained seated, her manicured fingers tapping lightly against her cup. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into," she warned, her voice dangerously soft. "Howard may think he cares for you, but feelings are fleeting, dear. And when he realizes that love doesn't conquer all, you'll be the one left in ruins." Karen turned on her heel and walked away, her heart pounding in her ears. But despite her defiance, doubt coiled inside her like a snake. Would Howard really fight for them, or was Dorothy right? Had she let herself believe in something that was never meant to last? Karen sat at the kitchen table, staring at her untouched cup of tea, her mind spinning with Dorothy's words. She had never doubted herself before, but now? Now, she was questioning everything. She had always been strong, independent, capable of standing on her own. But Howard had changed things. His presence in Aaron's life, in hers, had awakened something she had buried long ago, hope. And hope, she knew, could be dangerous. The sound of her phone vibrating pulled her from her thoughts, and when she saw the name flashing on the screen, she hesitated before answering. "Mom," she said softly, her voice wavering. It had been months since they had spoken, but somehow her mother always had a way of calling at the exact moment she needed guidance. "Karen, sweetheart." Her mother's voice was warm, but there was a knowing edge to it. "What's wrong?" Karen hesitated, then exhaled shakily. "I don't know what to do." Her mother's pause was telling. "This is about Aaron's father, isn't it?" Karen closed her eyes. "His stepmother cornered me today. She made it clear that she doesn't want me in Howard's life. She offered me money to walk away." Her mother scoffed. "And what did you say?" "That I don't want his money. That I want Aaron to have a relationship with his father." Karen swallowed hard. "But what if she's right? What if Howard's world isn't meant for us? What if I'm setting Aaron up to get hurt?" There was silence for a moment before her mother spoke, her voice steady. Karen, I raised you to be strong, to stand your ground. You've never been a woman who runs away from a fight. And you're not just fighting for yourself, you're fighting for your son. If Howard truly cares, if he's the man you think he is, then he'll prove it. But if he doesn't, then you walk away with your dignity intact, knowing you did everything you could. Karen's chest tightened, emotion thick in her throat. And if I get hurt, her mother's voice softened, then you heal, like you always do. Howard sat in his office, his fingers pressing into his temples as he replayed the conversation he had with Karen the night before. Something had shifted. She had been more distant, more hesitant, and it didn't take a genius to figure out why. Dorothy. He knew his stepmother well enough to know she had likely interfered, planting seeds of doubt where there had been none before. His jaw tightened, anger curling in his chest. He wouldn't let her ruin this, not this time. With a deep breath, he grabbed his phone and dialed Karen's number. It rang twice before she picked up. Howard, she said cautiously. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. Did Dorothy come to see you? A sharp intake of breath on the other end told him everything. Howard. What did she say? His voice was low, controlled, but she could hear the restrained fury beneath it. Karen sighed, and for the first time she sounded exhausted. She told me I was a distraction, that I didn't belong in your life. She offered me money to leave. Howard clenched his jaw. And did you consider it? The silence that followed was deafening. Karen, he pressed, his voice quieter now, but no less intense. Did you consider walking away? Finally, she exhaled. I don't know, she admitted, and the honesty in her voice gutted him. Howard, I'm scared. I don't know if I can fight this fight. I don't know if I can let Aaron get attached to a world that might eventually push us out. Howard ran a hand through his hair, his chest tight. Then let me make one thing clear, he said, his voice steady. I choose you. I choose Aaron, and if you think for 1 second that I'm going to let anyone, even Dorothy, dictate how I live my life, then you don't know me at all. Karen didn't respond immediately, but when she did, her voice was laced with uncertainty. And what if you wake up one day and realize that she was right? Howard's next words were soft, but they held a gravity that couldn't be ignored. Then I'll spend the rest of my life proving her wrong. Karen stood in the middle of her living room, staring at the text Howard had just sent. I need to see you, please. Her fingers hovered over the screen, hesitation gripping her chest like a vise. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that his words carried weight, that his promises weren't empty. But trust wasn't something she could give blindly anymore. Too much had been at stake for too long. She exhaled sharply, finally typing back. Not tonight. Aaron is asleep. It was an excuse, but also the truth. Because if Howard walked through her door tonight, she wasn't sure she'd be strong enough to keep him at a distance. Not when the walls between them were starting to crack. She set her phone down, rubbing her hands over her face, but a knock on the door made her stiffen. The audacity of him to show up anyway, but when she opened the door, it wasn't Howard standing there. It was Lucy, her best friend, holding a bottle of wine and an all-too-knowing smirk. Let me guess, Lucy said, stepping inside without invitation. Howard is crawling his way back, and you're trying to convince yourself that pushing him away is the smart thing to do. Karen groaned, shutting the door. I don't need a lecture, Lucy. Her best friend raised an eyebrow, settling onto the couch and pouring them both a glass. Good, because I'm not here to lecture. I'm here to remind you that not every man is your past. And maybe, just maybe, Howard is trying to prove that. Karen swallowed the lump in her throat, staring at the deep red swirl of her wine. And what if I let him in and he changes his mind? The vulnerability in her voice was almost unbearable. Lucy sighed, setting her glass down. Then you'll survive, Karen. But let's be real, you've already let him in. You're just too stubborn to admit it. Karen wanted to argue, to insist that she was protecting herself, protecting Aaron, but deep down, she knew Lucy was right. Howard was already in her heart, whether she was ready to admit it or not. And maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop fighting it. Howard paced outside Karen's apartment, his fists clenched at his sides, trying to convince himself that turning around and walking away was the right thing to do. But he couldn't. Not now. Not after everything. He had spent years making decisions with his head, not his heart, but this was different. Karen and Aaron weren't just another responsibility. This was his family. And for the first time in his life, he was terrified of losing something he couldn't replace. He knocked, stepping back as he heard movement inside. When the door opened, Karen stood there, wrapped in a loose sweater, her hair slightly messy from sleep. God, she was beautiful. Howard, she said softly, but he shook his head. No, just listen. His voice was rough, uneven. I know you don't trust me yet. I know you're scared that I'll let you down. But I swear to you, Karen, I'm not going anywhere. He exhaled heavily. I'm in this, completely. I don't care what my stepmother thinks. I don't care about anything else except making this work with you, with Aaron. Karen swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the doorframe. And what if it's too late? She whispered. Howard took a step closer, his gaze searching hers. Do you want it to be? Silence stretched between them, heavy and unspoken. And then, in a moment of reckless surrender, Karen closed the distance between them, her lips crashing against his. The kiss was desperate, raw, years of longing, of missed chances, of everything unspoken igniting between them like wildfire. Howard groaned, his hands cupping her face as he deepened the kiss, pouring every ounce of emotion into it. Karen clung to him, her heart hammering against her ribs, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe. When they finally pulled apart, their breaths ragged, Howard rested his forehead against hers. Tell me this isn't too late, he murmured. Karen's eyes fluttered shut. I don't know how to do this, she admitted. Howard's fingers brushed against her cheek. Then let's figure it out together. The morning light seeped through the windows, casting a golden glow over the room, but Karen had barely slept. The weight of what had happened the night before still lingered, curling around her like an inescapable truth. She had kissed Howard, she had let him in, and now there was no turning back. She moved quietly through the apartment, her heart twisting as she peeked into Aaron's room, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest as he slept. This wasn't just about her, it was about him too. If she let Howard in, she was risking more than just her heart. She was risking Aaron's, and that terrified her. A soft knock at the door made her tense, but she already knew who it was. She opened it slowly, and Howard stood there, looking far too handsome in the morning light, his expression unreadable. Hey, he said softly. Karen exhaled, stepping aside to let him in. He moved past her, glancing toward Aaron's room before turning back to her. We need to talk. Karen nodded, wrapping her arms around herself. I know. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze. Last night, I don't regret it, Howard. But I need to know that this isn't just a moment for you. I need to know that you're not going to wake up one day and decide this isn't the life you want. Howard stepped forward, cupping her face in his hands. Karen, look at me. She did, her breath catching as his thumb brushed against her cheek. I have spent years chasing things that don't matter. I have built an empire, made more money than I'll ever need. But none of it meant anything. You and Aaron, you are what matters, and I will spend every day proving that to you. Karen's throat tightened. She wanted to believe him, but belief had never come easy for her. She exhaled shakily, nodding once. Okay. Howard's lips curved into a small smile. Okay. Karen let out a soft laugh. Yeah, okay. And for the first time in a long time, she let herself hope. Howard stood at the balcony of his penthouse, the city lights stretching endlessly before him, but his mind was nowhere near the towering skyline. His thoughts were entirely consumed by Karen. He had spent years making calculated decisions, ensuring that every move he made was strategic, but nothing about about her, felt like a calculated decision. It felt raw, terrifying, and completely out of his control. Yet, for the first time in his life, he welcomed it. He turned when he heard the sound of the elevator opening, his pulse quickening as Karen stepped into the room, hesitant but breathtaking as ever. She had no idea what he was about to do. You wanted to see me? She asked softly, her fingers knotting together as if bracing herself for something. Howard inhaled deeply, stepping toward her, his eyes never leaving hers. Yeah, he said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. There's something I need to ask you. Karen furrowed her brows, confusion flickering across her face. Howard, what's going on? He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box before sinking to one knee. Karen's sharp intake of breath was the only sound in the room. I know this is fast, Howard admitted, his voice laced with emotion. I know we're still figuring things out, but I also know that I don't want to spend another day without knowing you'll be by my side. You and Aaron, you're my family, Karen, and I want to make it official. Karen's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes brimming with disbelief. Howard, she whispered, her voice shaking. Are you serious? Howard nodded, his gaze unwavering. More than I've ever been about anything. Karen's chest rose and fell rapidly, her entire world tilting beneath her feet. She had spent so long protecting her heart, but in this moment, she realized something. Maybe she didn't have to anymore. Karen sat at the edge of Aaron's bed, watching the soft rise and fall of his chest as he slept. The engagement ring on her finger felt both heavy and surreal, as if the weight of everything it symbolized was still settling in. She had said yes, and yet doubt gnawed at the edges of her mind, whispering fears she couldn't silence. What if Howard changed his mind? What if their happiness was temporary? What if she had just set herself up for heartbreak? A soft voice broke through her thoughts. Mommy? Aaron's sleepy eyes fluttered open, his small voice filled with drowsy curiosity. Karen brushed a gentle hand through his hair, forcing a smile. I'm here, baby. Aaron rubbed his eyes before glancing at her hand, his gaze locking onto the sparkling ring. His lips parted slightly, confusion flickering across his young face. Is that a special ring? He asked, tilting his head. Karen hesitated before nodding. Yes, sweetheart. Howard gave it to me. Aaron blinked slowly before a small smile spread across his face. Does that mean we get to be a family now? Karen's breath hitched, her throat tightening painfully. She hadn't realized how much Aaron had longed for something she had spent years convincing herself they didn't need. She swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady. It means Howard wants to be a part of our lives forever. Aaron's grin widened. I like that, he murmured sleepily, already drifting back to sleep. Karen sat there for a long time, watching him, feeling the full weight of her decision settle in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, love didn't have to be complicated. Maybe, after everything, they deserved to be happy. And as she placed a gentle kiss on Aaron's forehead, she silently prayed that Howard would keep his promise, because now it wasn't just her heart on the line. It was their son's too. The moment the engagement was made public, chaos erupted. Howard had expected some backlash, particularly from Dorothy, but what he hadn't expected was the sheer level of fury she unleashed. This is a mistake, Howard, she hissed, her polished nails tapping against the marble counter of his office. You think this woman, this nobody, is fit to be your wife? To represent the Lewis name? Howard didn't so much as flinch, his expression cold and unwavering. Karen is more of a woman than anyone in your carefully curated social circle will ever be, he said evenly, his tone carrying a warning. And she's going to be my wife, whether you like it or not. Dorothy's nostrils flared, but Howard saw something beneath the anger, fear. His stepmother had spent years controlling him, molding his life into something she deemed acceptable. But she was losing her grip now, and she knew it. You're making a mistake, she repeated, her voice softer this time, almost pleading. Howard, think about what you're giving up. Howard's jaw tightened. I'm not giving up anything, he said firmly. I'm gaining a family. Dorothy exhaled sharply, realizing that there was no changing his mind. For the first time, she had lost. Meanwhile, Karen faced her own battle with doubt. As congratulations flooded in from some and disapproval poured in from others, she felt the pressure mounting. Are you sure you're ready for this? Lucy asked one evening, watching Karen carefully as they sat together in her apartment. Because once you marry him, your life will change forever. Karen exhaled shakily, staring at the ring on her finger. I don't know, she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. But I love him, and I love what we're building. Lucy nodded, offering a reassuring smile. Then that's enough. Karen prayed she was right, because now there was no turning back. The wedding was happening, and soon she would no longer just be Karen Adams. She would be Karen Lewis. Karen stood in the bridal boutique, staring at her reflection in the full-length mirror, her fingers lightly grazing the lace of the gown that hugged her frame. The woman staring back at her didn't look like the same person she had been 5 years ago. This woman was different, stronger, bolder, unafraid of what lay ahead. And yet, as she adjusted the delicate sleeves of the dress, a quiet doubt lingered in her mind. Was she truly ready for this? The weight of everything, the love, the commitment, the family they were about to build, felt overwhelming. Lucy, seated on the plush couch beside her, tapped her chin thoughtfully before breaking into a grin. "You look breathtaking," she said. "Howard's going to lose his mind when he sees you." Karen chuckled softly, shaking her head. I can't believe this is real," she admitted. "After everything we've been through, after all the doubts, we're actually doing this." Lucy arched an eyebrow. "Well, you could always run," she teased. But her expression softened when she saw the way Karen's fingers tightened around the fabric of her dress. "But you won't, because you love him." Karen exhaled, her heart pounding as she turned to face her best friend. "I do," she whispered. "I love him so much it scares me." Lucy walked up behind her, resting a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Then stop thinking about the past and start looking at the future." Karen nodded slowly, taking a deep breath. This was her future, Howard, Aaron, and the family they were creating together. Later that evening, she found herself standing on Howard's penthouse balcony, the city sprawling beneath them like a sea of golden lights. Howard came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and pressing a soft kiss to her temple. "You're quiet tonight," he murmured. Karen leaned into him, savoring the warmth of his embrace. "Just thinking," she admitted. Howard turned her gently so she was facing him. "Tell me," he urged. She hesitated, then met his gaze. "I'm scared," she whispered. "Not of you, not of us, but of losing this, of losing you." Howard cupped her face, his eyes filled with quiet certainty. "You won't," he promised. "I'm not going anywhere." The morning of the wedding arrived with a quiet kind of chaos, florists bustling in and out, stylists arranging final touches, guests arriving in waves. Karen sat in front of the vanity mirror, watching as her makeup artist put the finishing touches on her face, her reflection framed by soft curls cascading over her shoulders. Today wasn't just about the ceremony, it was about everything that had led her here. Every sleepless night, every moment of doubt, every battle she had fought to protect Aaron, all of it had brought her to this day, to this moment. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts, and when it opened, Aaron peeked in, dressed in his little tuxedo, his eyes wide with admiration. "Mommy," he whispered, stepping closer, "you look like a princess." Karen felt her heart squeeze as she pulled him into her arms. "And you, my love, look like the most handsome prince in the world." Aaron grinned, then hesitated. "Are you happy?" he asked, his small voice uncertain. Karen blinked back sudden tears, cupping his tiny face in her hands. "The happiest I've ever been," she assured him, "because I have you. And now we have Howard, too." Aaron nodded solemnly, as if absorbing the importance of her words. "I like Howard," he admitted. "He makes you smile." Karen smiled softly, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "Yes, he does." The ceremony itself felt like a dream. As she walked down the aisle, her arm linked with Lucy's, who insisted on standing in as her honorary maid of honor, her eyes locked onto Howard's. The world faded around them, and in that moment, nothing else existed but the man waiting for her at the end of the aisle. When she reached him, Howard took her hands, his grip firm yet reverent, as if anchoring her to him forever. "You're breathtaking," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Karen let out a soft laugh, blinking back tears. "You're not so bad yourself." And as they exchanged vows, sealing their future with words of love and promises of forever, Karen finally let go of every fear, every doubt, because she had won. They had won, and nothing could take this away from them. The reception was a whirlwind of laughter, dancing, and celebration. Karen moved through the crowd, greeting well-wishers, her hand never straying far from Howard's. They were a team now, an unbreakable unit. But the moment she had been waiting for most came when she finally found Aaron, sitting at a table with a slice of cake far too big for a 5-year-old. "Hey, buddy," she murmured, ruffling his hair as she sat beside him. "Having fun?" Aaron nodded enthusiastically, his mouth full of chocolate frosting. "Best day ever," he declared. Karen chuckled, her heart swelling with warmth. But before she could say anything else, Howard appeared beside her, pressing a kiss to the top of her head before crouching beside Aaron. "What do you say we make this even better?" he asked, his voice laced with something mischievous. Aaron tilted his head. "How?" Howard reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a small, neatly wrapped box. "This is for you," he said, handing it to him. Aaron's tiny fingers eagerly unwrapped the package, revealing a small silver bracelet engraved with his name on one side, and on the other, a simple but powerful message, "Forever a Lewis." Aaron's eyes widened as he looked up at Howard, his bottom lip quivering. "Does this mean I'm really part of your family now?" he whispered. Howard's throat bobbed as he nodded. "It means you've always been part of my family," he said softly. "But now you'll never have to wonder again." Aaron launched himself into Howard's arms, and for the first time, Howard felt the completeness he had been searching for his entire life. Karen watched, her heart so full she thought it might burst. This was it, the life she had fought for, the love she had feared but embraced anyway. And as Howard pulled her into their embrace, pressing a soft kiss to her lips, she knew with unwavering certainty this was just the beginning. The weeks following the wedding had been a whirlwind of adjustment, laughter, and quiet, stolen moments between Karen and Howard. But tonight was different. Tonight was a moment of stillness, a moment where everything they had built, everything they had fought for, finally settled into place. Karen stood on the balcony of their new home, wrapped in the soft silk of her robe, gazing at the endless stretch of city lights below. The air was crisp, carrying with it the faint scent of rain, but all she could think about was the warmth that had settled in her heart. She didn't flinch when Howard came up behind her, his strong arms encircling her waist as he pressed a soft kiss to the crook of her neck. "You're quiet," he murmured, his breath warm against her skin. Karen exhaled, leaning into him. "Just thinking," she admitted, her fingers tracing slow, idle patterns over his hand. "About what?" Howard asked, tilting his head slightly to look at her. She turned to face him, her gaze filled with something so deep, so raw, that it nearly stole his breath. "About how, for the first time in a long time, I don't feel like I have to fight anymore." Howard's expression softened, and he reached up to cup her face, his thumb brushing over her cheek. "That's because you don't," he said, his voice carrying the kind of certainty that made her chest tighten. "You don't have to fight for love anymore, Karen. Not with me. Not with Aaron. We're here. We're yours." Karen let out a shaky breath, blinking back the sting of tears. "I spent so many years thinking I had to do it all alone," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "That if I let myself rely on someone, I'd just end up disappointed." Howard's grip on her tightened, his gaze filled with unwavering determination. "You don't have to do anything alone ever again," he promised, his voice thick with emotion. "I love you, Karen. I love you and Aaron more than I ever thought I was capable of loving anyone, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life proving that to you." Karen swallowed hard, emotion tightening her throat. For so long, she had been afraid to believe in forever. But now forever didn't seem so scary. The sound of small footsteps padding across the hardwood floor made them both turn, and a moment later, Aaron appeared, his tiny form silhouetted against the soft glow of the hallway light. His hair was tousled from sleep, his eyes still heavy with drowsiness. "Mommy? Daddy?" he murmured, rubbing his eyes. Karen's heart squeezed at the way he said it, so naturally, as if he had always known Howard as his father. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" she asked, crouching down to his level. Aaron hesitated for a moment before glancing up at Howard. "I had a dream," he admitted, "that we weren't a family anymore." Karen's breath hitched, and before she could say anything, Howard crouched beside her, placing a reassuring hand on Aaron's small shoulder. "That's never going to happen, buddy," he said, his voice filled with a quiet strength. "Families aren't just about blood or names. They're about love, and love doesn't go away just because we close our eyes." Aaron's lips quivered, and then, without warning, he launched himself into Howard's arms, clinging to him tightly. "Promise?" he whispered against his father's shoulder. Howard's arms tightened around him, his voice thick with emotion. "I promise," he said without hesitation. Karen watched them, a lump forming in her throat. She had spent years being everything for Aaron, his protector, his provider, his safe place. And now, for the first time, she wasn't doing it alone. She wasn't just Aaron's anchor anymore. She had one, too. Howard met her gaze over their son's head, and in that moment, everything clicked into place. This was it. This was home. As Aaron yawned, his little arms still wrapped around his father, Howard lifted him effortlessly, carrying him back to bed, while Karen followed close behind. As she tucked Aaron in, pressing a soft kiss to his forehead, Howard reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers. "Come to bed," he murmured. Karen let herself be led, let herself believe that, for the first time in her life, she had everything she had ever needed, because love had found her in the most unexpected way. And this time, she wasn't running from it. She was holding on forever. Here's the Bible verse for the story, Romans 8, verse 28. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Why this verse? Karen's journey is one of resilience, faith, and eventual fulfillment. Though she endured heartbreak, uncertainty, and the fear of raising her child alone, God was orchestrating something greater behind the scenes. The trials she faced were not in vain. They led her back to Howard, not just as the father of her child, but as the partner who would love her unconditionally. This verse reinforces the theme that even in the midst of pain, God is always working for our good, leading us toward blessings we never imagined. Moral of the story: love, when it is true, finds its way back to where it belongs. Karen and Howard's story teaches us that one, patience and faith lead to divine timing. What is meant for you will always find you, no matter how much time has passed. Two, forgiveness is not just about the past, it's about the future. Karen had to let go of her fears to embrace the love standing in front of her. Three, family is not just about blood, it's about presence and commitment. Howard proved that being a father isn't just about biology, but about showing up and loving unconditionally. Four, no one is meant to walk through life alone. Karen spent years believing she had to do everything by herself, but in the end, love and partnership made her stronger. The story reminds us that sometimes God's greatest blessings come from the most unexpected reunions. What is truly yours will never pass you by. That's the end of the story. What did you learn from this story? Drop your thoughts in the comments section. Leave a like and don't forget to subscribe and turn on post notification so that you'll be notified whenever we drop our next videos.